Hello and welcome to Bracewell's Data Center Counsel Podcast. From energy and utilities to siting and financing, our attorneys cover the opportunities and issues with data center development.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jared Berg, and welcome back to Data Center Counsel. Excited to have you with us for another episode. And today I am back with Bryan Clark. I am a partner in our corporate and securities and energy projects group and one of the co-leads of our digital infrastructure and data center team here at Bracewell. Bryan is a former associate general counsel at Pioneer Natural Resources, where he worked on midstream marketing matters as well as all of their power matters. So Bryan is a great person to have with us here. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the regulatory overlay in the state of Texas when it comes to power generation and large load interconnections. So today, we're going to be talking about Senate Bill 6 and what that is purporting to do to the process. We're also going to talk about the new batching process that has been announced, but more details are still coming. And just for purposes of keeping everybody honest here, it's January 13th, 2026. So more updates come on the batching process in particular, as well as Senate Bill 6 as it's going through the rulemaking process. But maybe to kick us off here, Bryan, can you walk us through, before all these updates, before Senate Bill 6 came out, before the batching process started coming about, if you wanted to build a large load, say a data center or a chip manufacturer or something like that, or a gas processing facility, and you wanted to interconnect that with the grid, what would the process generally high level look like? What would what applications do you have to file? People talk about studies that have to be conducted. What does that process look like, and who's doing what, who's leading it? And then we can dive into some of the changes that are anticipated as a result of batching and Senate Bill 6.
On a high level, what the large load would end up doing is they would have their specifications essentially lined up, what they need, how they need it, when they need it by. And when they have that information, they would then go to their transmission and distribution utility, their local utility they receive service from, and they would meet with them and they would discuss the project details, timelines, so on and so forth. At that point in time, essentially the utility becomes the interface between the customer and ERCOT. ERCOT, as the manager of the Texas grid, relies upon information that it receives from the utility. So the utility would take the information from the customer, conduct their own studies, their load studies, understand what the capacity of their transmission system is in that particular area, and then provide that information to ERCOT. And when I say provide that information to ERCOT, there are several groups or committees at ERCOT that study the Texas market to understand what capabilities exist, what capabilities aren't available in a particular area, and they work hand in glove with the utilities on these type of projects, and they evaluate the utilities information, they evaluate the utility study, and then the utilities take this information that they've gotten from ERCOT and work with the customer on a construction timeline, making sure the appropriate agreements are in place. Like, for instance, a facilities extension agreement, that if the utility needs to build certain equipment or certain infrastructure to reach the customer, then they line that out. They may require a contribution in aid of construction, meaning that the customer pays for a certain amount, financial guarantees in place, so on and so forth. So to answer your question, in order to summarize, it's very utility specific. It's a lot of interaction between the customer and the utility, with ERCOT essentially sitting there in the background working with the utility based upon the information that the utility receives from the customer.
So basically, like if I had a data center and it's 200 megawatts, call it, or let's make it fun. Let's say it's 2 gigawatts, and I'm going to put that out in the middle of rural Texas, let's say Bexar County or something like that. We plop that data center out there. We call the local utility and say, hey, I need 2 gigawatts and I need it by, 2028. Then they go to ERCOT. ERCOT says, whoa. You've got no infrastructure out there where you're planning to do this. So we're going to have to build, a 345 kV line from point A to point B. And then you're going to have to build a substation here. And you're going to have to build maybe some additional protective equipment over there. And all of that is kind of coming out of the ERCOT study process that they're working through with the TSP or the transmission service provider, right?
It would be more dependent upon the TSP at that point in time. It would be the TSP determining what equipment's needed. Are you going to need to have a substation put in? It would be the TSP working with ERCOT to determine if there's capability or capacity in the lines in those areas or the lines that would support that project. If not, then that would also go into the process a separate process that the TSP would manage for building out its transmission infrastructure. They would say that there is a market demand. They would use this as a market data point to go to ERCOT and the PUC to say, okay, we have enough demand in this area. We're filing for a certificate from the PUCT to allow for us to build additional infrastructure, either an entirely new line or loop a line, meaning putting in additional capabilities in existing transmission path to support this project. So it's very much a balancing act that, frankly, I think, in my opinion, the TSP manages with working with ERCOT, getting the appropriate market information. If it needs to, getting ERCOT to sign off on a new project that can then go to the PUC so that the utility can have the approval for a new project that then it can then build, and those costs can be rolled into rate base so that in the next rate case that the utility has, it can say, okay, everybody, ERCOT, PUC, with the appropriate market information, approved this project. I spent X number of dollars on this project. I want to recover the costs of this from rate base, which means that all the customers of the utility essentially pay for it through the usage that they receive from the utility.
That's helpful, Bryan, and appreciate you walking us through all that. So I guess once we've worked through that process with the utility, thinking about what's happening with SB6 and maybe touching on what we talked about in our last episode, we talked about how there's been an influx of these interconnection applications. And in the past, historically, it's been first come, first served, right?
In essence, yes.
In essence. So then when you have this influx of applications, and on our last episode, we talked a little bit about how, some of these applications aren't necessarily real. Now, one of the chicken and egg problems that you run into if you're trying to develop a project, right, is in order to attract a tenant, you have to show that, okay, I'm going to be interconnected by X date, right? So in order for a Google or a Meta or OpenAI to commit to using a data center, they've got to know when they're going to actually get power. So on the flip side, you don't know if you have a project until you have a tenant.
Right.
So you have to make these applications. But then this influx of applications has slowed down the queue. It's gummed up the process, right?
Short answer, yes.
So in comes Senate Bill 6 trying to address part of these problems, some of these problems. And maybe, Bryan, you gave us a really high level overview in the last episode, but maybe you can talk a little more today about what exactly Senate Bill 6 is doing and how it's trying to address different problems. Is it really just focused on trying to reduce the interconnection queue, or is it addressing a bunch more stuff than that?
It's meant to address the interconnection process, the interconnection queue, as well as other issues that have just presented themselves through the natural development of the electric market in Texas. I mean, long story short, with Senate Bill 6, it also came about in the long shadow of Winter Storm Uri and what the state went through and how it dealt with Winter Storm Uri, with the blackout conditions that we all had to deal with, and how you can essentially not redesign the market, but make the market better for all consumers, not only large load consumers, but for generation that's connected to the grid, as well as for everyday consumers like yourself and myself. So what Senate Bill 6 did, first of all, it recognized that there was this influx of large load interconnection requests. And so what it is attempting to do through the rulemaking, it meaning the bill, was intended by the legislators and Governor Abbott, as well as how it's being implemented through the rulemaking proceeding at the PUCT, is that they're trying to create an interconnection standardization and cost sharing for everybody that's coming into the Texas market and making these interconnection requests. What you had is, and I think you still do to a certain extent, is you may have a company coming in and a developer or whatever entity making 3 or 4 or 5 requests for interconnection all across the state to various utilities. Now, the utilities are working within their own certificated territories. What a provider or a potential customer in CenterPoint may be making the same requests in the CenterPoint territory around Houston, may be making the same request in the Encore territory around Dallas.
Are they doing that just to hedge their bets or because they've got multiple projects?
It could be both. It could, and what SB 6, first of all, was trying to do was deal with entities that were in essence hedging their bets.
Yep.
It's requiring them to disclose, are you making another request within the state? And so, in asking them, well, if you get this one request granted first, say in the CenterPoint area, are you going to drop your request in the Encore territory?
Yeah.
And so it's just trying to rationalize the market to make sure that when a party is making a request, it's acting in a manner is open disclosure, saying, okay, I'm making a request here, I'm making a request here. So hopefully it will cut down on essentially gaming the system. Second of all, and you've seen this not only in Texas, but throughout the country where data centers are being built everywhere, is the cost sharing. Some states are saying like, okay, large users of electricity, you're going to be responsible for all the costs of interconnecting. Other states are saying, well, some of these costs are going to be rolled in the rate base and so on and so forth, meaning that everybody pays for them instead of just the primary user. So what SB 6 is trying to do is set standardizations for both electric utilities, or what's referred to investor-owned utilities, as well as electric cooperatives and municipally owned utilities all across the state so that the procedures are the same. So they're doing things like you're required to make an upfront payment to cover the facility studies costs, each utility entity, as well as proving that you have site control for where you want to put in your data center. So, and what I mean by site control is that they have a long-term lease or that they own the land, which they're actually going to put the facility, instead of saying like, I'm just going to throw in a load request to you, Encore, and say, okay, I'm thinking about putting it at this specific location where you may not have any control. You're just waiting for the interconnection request first for whatever reason. So they're trying to rationalize the process. Another aspect of SB 6 is what's called net metering arrangements for co-located facilities with existing generation. And what I mean, and that's a lot to unpack, and I'll try to do it simply and succinctly.
All right.
We'll see. Essentially, a co-located facility means that there is already a generation facility located that's connected to the grid providing electricity. That plant, say it may be 800 megawatts, but because of the way the market changes over the years, say the facility was built 15 years ago, and really it only maximizes to most of the year at around, say, 500 megawatts. So they have an extra 300 megawatts. A manufacturer or a data center may come in and say, hey, we'll take 200 megawatts off of your hands on a firm basis, that all at 24/7, 365. And so what they will do is they'll build their facility next to the generation plant and essentially tie into that generation plant at potentially the switchyard or substation right next to the plant and be co-located with that generation. And so what the PUC has said is these plants were originally for the market. Now you're essentially taking electricity away from the market, we want to know about it and we want to have an approval process for you to do that, essentially taking electricity off the market for a firm use that's co-located, what's referred to in the industry as behind the meter. And so they directed the PUC to devise rules for that, as well as curtailment of large loads. In the back and forth of how SB 6 was written and negotiated essentially at the legislature, what you had with Winter Storm Uri, you could potentially have large loads using electricity during high demand time periods when it's either really cold or really hot outside. And if a plant or two happens to go down or what's referred to as derate, that could destabilize the grid. And so large loads are something that can quickly be taken offline or removed from the system to stabilize the grid for the rest of us so that we don't have to endure blackout situations like Uri. And so the give and take between various parties when the legislation was being drafted was this is what's known as essentially the kill switch option. What this means is if there's an energy emergency as declared by ERCOT and you have a large load that's interconnected to the grid, ERCOT can direct the utilities to go to that large load customer and say, you have to shut down during these periods of energy emergencies. Full stop. That's what the legislation says. And so that was to get everything else in SB 6, the large load, I would say, customers that were active at the legislature essentially agreed to this. They're saying everything else is good. We'll agree to the kill switch option. And so as an incentive with the kill switch option, you have ERCOT creating a new demand response program for large loads. And what demand response is in essence an ancillary service, meaning a secondary service of the market. What it means is in a demand response, you sign up for a demand response program, and under certain conditions, you agree to reduce your demand in exchange for payment. So for this new demand response program for large loads, the idea is if you have a large load that will willingly, instead of potentially facing the kill switch option during an energy emergency, they may sign up for the demand response program. So if ERCOT determines based upon forecasts that they're coming close to declaring an energy emergency, the demand response program may be designed so it goes out to those large load customers that have signed up for this program and say, we want to avoid this. Can you take your load off and we'll give you X number of dollars to do so for a set period of time?
So maybe it sounds like kind of what you're describing is that they're maybe trying to, and I know that this will all be kind of borne out in rulemaking procedures that are ongoing right now, but it sounds like what they're trying to create is effectively a waterfall of load shed. So I know that one of the elements of SB 6 is requires disclosure of facilities that have backup power that can satisfy at least 50% of their load. So I guess the idea here is maybe setting it up so that, you know, at the top of the waterfall, the first load to be shed are the companies that have, or the projects and facilities that have signed up for the demand response program. And then the next level of the waterfall are those that have on-site backup to satisfy their operations. And then only after that will you start dipping into additional large load, or at the very, you know, for curtailment purposes, or at the very least, that's one way that it could end up working out, right? Yeah. Interesting. So it sounds like they are trying to solve the problem and through a fairly creative means. I know that we haven't really seen anything like this, you know, exactly like this kind of presented across the rest of the country yet, but I'm sure that there are talks about it going on. So as part of all of that, one of the considerations has to be, okay, well, if you're going to participate in the demand response program and you have a critical load, right? You have to have 5 nines availability. You're a data center, you're servicing, you know, kind of a critical element of the infrastructure. Or you know, you're a chip manufacturer and you just cannot afford to shut down because you will lose some element of your productivity and then result in, you know, lost revenues, what have you. For those companies, what's the alternative? Are they basically forced to go and build on-site generation? Is that really the best alternative? Is it truly backup that they're looking for? Or could we potentially see solutions built here where somebody builds their own generation and then also provides that to the grid?
In essence, yes. I mean, I tend to shy away from one market participant or another being forced to do something. And maybe it's the lawyer inside of me is SB6 is creating a framework. The PUCT is creating a framework for parties to operate by moving forward. If you're a large load consumer and you know there is that kill switch option available in times of energy emergency, and if your manufacturing project, if your data center, if you know that you need to run at 5 nines, which for those who may not know, 5 nines is that you're providing your services 99.999% of the time, which basically works out to being offline about an hour or two a year. If you need to maintain that much reliability and you know the kill switch option is out there, you're going to develop your own energy resource that is what's known as behind the meter or BTM. And what that energy resource is going to look like depends upon your needs. You may want to say, I will have a mobile generator. Say if I'm an oil and gas producer that is drilling in a critical area that needs to meet a tight timeline, I'll have mobile generation on site in case something happens. If I'm a data center that needs 5 nines, I'm going to have modular generation available. I may construct my own simple cycle or combined cycle natural gas fired generator next to me and rely upon that and use the grid as backup. It provides different situations depending upon what those market participants need for their electricity.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it, Bryan. It's more of a framework that creates incentives to operate a certain way, taking into account your operating reality as a business owner, right?
Correct. And so if I'm a data center and if I'm a data center developer or I'm a hyperscaler and I need 5 nines, I would think I would want to have a simple cycle or combined cycle natural gas generation facility next to me that can provide a significant portion of the electricity needs that I want. And if I'm able to connect to a pipeline nearby with natural gas produced in Texas, of which there's a plentiful amount, then I will use that option. I will have a sophisticated power marketing team to tell me when I should be drawing from that generator and when I can dispatch it into the market. I may find that if I can secure a long-term supply from the grid under a long-term contract that is, I have avoided costs, I may use that and only use my generator as needed. Or the reverse situation can be used in which I depend highly on the generator that I install and use the grid as backup. And I may want to participate in the large load demand response program. Maybe the ancillary payments are going to be high enough that I want to participate in that market. As you said, Jared, it's creating the incentive structure so that participants know what the rules are and that they can participate in the market accordingly.
Well, that's a great way, I think, to kind of put a pin in that in the SB6 discussion, and maybe turn a little bit here to the interconnection process and some recent developments that are happening. And again, I'll remind the audience here that it's January 13th and 2026. So there are developments more to come, and we will update you guys as they occur. But in the interim, Bryan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this batching process that we've heard rumblings about.
As we discussed in the last episode briefly, beginning with the oil and gas industry and then becoming more pronounced with the influx of data centers potentially connecting to the ERCOT grid, the interconnection queue and the number of gigawatts associated with it has grown exponentially over the past 18 months. ERCOT began looking at this process and trying to develop a framework on how to handle large load interconnection requests beginning in 2022 with an interim process. They developed certain portions of their planning guides to specifically address large load interconnections that they initially published in June of 2025 and finalized in mid-December of 2025. Historically, loads, small, large, medium, they had worked with their transmission service providers, and essentially there wasn't a queue, so to speak. It's just that that's how it naturally developed. I come in with my load request in January. The TSB begins analyzing it. The next entity comes in March. They begin analyzing it, and it develops into a natural queue. With the influx of large load interconnection requests over the past 18 months, essentially that process broke down. And what you ended up having, even with the interim process, even with the new planning guides, as it was explained to me, was that you would have a large load come in, they would work through the planning process with their transmission service provider, but you may have other entities coming in after an initial request and saying, hey, I'm thinking about building in the same area. Why don't I just kind of piggyback on this initial request? And then you might have a third party saying, oh, I want to piggyback, just kind of expand out the study process so all of us can be included. And so that just slowed down the process. It made it essentially untenable or unworkable. And so beginning in November of 2025, ERCOT began evaluating internally, is there a different way of doing this? And at December 18th PUCT open meeting, ERCOT described that they had engaged McKinsey & Company to begin studying what's called a batching process. And what this is essentially is developing a new large load interconnection request through batches instead of individually. And so what they want to do is to be able to look and see in a particular area based upon certain circumstances, which as Jared said, January 13th is still being worked out. What characteristics of certain requests can put them into certain batches to make sure that the large load interconnection request follows some systematic basis for moving forward. And so the idea is ERCOT is initially working with McKinsey is initially going to come in with batch 0. And in essence, batch 0 will look like is requests that don't need to be restudied and can be considered firm. Requests that have met certain milestones, but may require certain restudy elements can still be included in batch 0. And then requests that are early in the process will be studied in later batches. So the idea is you'll have an initial batch 0, and those interconnection requests will move forward and be granted and begin the process of connecting to the ERCOT transmission system in a time frame as to be determined. And then you'll have batch 1, and then you'll have batch 2 as you move on. So and the batches in and of themselves will become their own queue instead of individual projects. And so what ERCOT and McKinsey are doing right now are conducting interviews with various stakeholders throughout the ERCOT process. This includes hyperscalers, data center developers, contractors, co-locators, investor-owned utilities, independent generators, residential and municipal entities, basically the whole gamut of the electric industry in Texas.
And so again, just to summarize there, Bryan, it sounds like what they're trying to address is basically putting an endpoint so that you can study a bunch of requests all at once, get a clear picture as to what needs to be done in order to bolster the grid, ensure reliability or whatever with respect to that group of large load interconnection requests. And then while that study is undergoing, the next batch will kind of grow and build, and then they'll turn to that next batch as opposed to doing one at a time. Is that about right?
Yes.
Now, I imagine that, it'd be good if you want a project in the next couple of years online, it's going to be important to hit that batch 0, because I guess we don't really know what the interconnection timeline will look like for batch 0 versus batch 1.
I think once ERCOT rolls out the process, we'll have a better understanding. But as of right now, January 13th, 2026, we don't.
For sure.
And I mean, I think as part of this process, what you end up doing is making sure that if you think you need to belong in batch 0, you work with your utility to make sure that you can be placed into batch 0 or to see if you have the characteristics to be in batch 0.
Got it. And if you don't, what can you do to make sure that you do?
Exactly.
All right. Well, Bryan, I really appreciate it. This has been another great conversation. I think we'll call it an episode at that. Again, everybody, thank you very much for joining us. This was Bryan Clark and Jared Berg at Bracewell on the Data Center Counsel Podcast. Appreciate you joining us, and we'll look forward to talking with you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Bracewell's Data Center Counsel Podcast. To contact any of today's guests, please reach out to datacentercounsel@bracewell.com.